Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Reed Regional event with Linda Green that was reorganised from last year. Before we start, can I just ask everybody to mute themselves and also switch their cameras off? And if you could do that for the duration of the talk, that would be brilliant. We do have a chat facility, so if you have any questions that you want to ask Linda, if you can just pop the questions in there and I can ask them to Linda as we're going. So I'm just going to read you a little bit about Linda before we start. Linda Green is the best-selling author of 10 novels, which have sold more than 1 million copies and been translated into 12 languages. Her latest emotional drama, One Moment, has been selected as a BBC Radio 2 Book Club pick. Linda has lived in West Yorkshire since 2001, but was born in North London in 1970 and brought up in Hertfordshire. She joined her local newspaper, the Enfield Gazette, as a trainee reporter at 18, and during a 10-year career in regional journalism, she worked on the Birmingham Daily News, Birmingham Metro News, and Coventry Evening Telegraph, winning highly commended in the Feature Writer of the Year category of the 1997 Press Gazette Regional Press Awards. In 1998, she left her staff job to write her first novel and work as a freelance journalist. She has written for The Guardian, The Independent on Sunday, The Times Educational Supplement, The Big Issue, Wonderlust, and Community Care magazine. Linda is also a qualified adult education tutor and has taught creative writing to students from 8 to 80. Linda's first psychological thriller, While My Eyes Were Closed, published in 2016, has sold more than 450,000 copies across all editions. Her ninth novel, The Last Thing She Told Me, was a Richard and Judy book club pick. So after that brief introduction, welcome Linda, and we'll start by asking you, how did you become an author?
Yes, well, I was one of those annoying children who actually knew what they wanted to do when they were really young. I know it's annoying because my son's the same. He doesn't want to be a writer, fortunately, but now. So I was absolutely set on a career as an author, but I was also, I realised you couldn't just leave school and become an author. So I decided when I was a teenager that I wanted to be a journalist, and that's what I'll do. And I'd do, my apprenticeship really was as a journalist, and using writing to earn a living until I got to the point where I felt it was a good time to write a book. So I say I had 10 years in regional papers, as you said. I absolutely loved it. It was fantastic in terms of meeting people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, and so many times my writing has been inspired by people and stories that I came across during those years. And then basically it got to the point where I think it was a combination that my features were getting a bit too long. And my feature editor said to me once, you want to write a book, don't you? And I said, yeah, I do. And at that point, I had a small, we were living, just me and my husband, in a small cottage, no children at that point. And I thought, well, you know what? If I don't do it now, I probably never will. So I did the thing everyone tells you not to do, which is I gave up the day job. Don't ever give up your day job, because and I freelanced. Well, I wrote the first book. What I didn't know is I would get 102 rejections from agents over 7 years before I finally got my first book deal. So I am very proud that I persevered, because obviously the completely sensible thing would be to have stopped at 100. I mean, if not 50, to be honest. But I was so determined. It was my lifetime's ambition. I didn't want to stop, so I carried on. It was actually the second book I'd written that got that book deal at that time. I got myself an agent finally. They got me a book deal with Headline, and I was on my way, but it was a long time getting there.
It definitely sounds it. I'm amazed you kept going after 102 rejections. Good on you. And I'm glad you did, because
Thank you.
Are absolutely brilliant. Do you think being a journalist helped you with the whole process of becoming an author?
I think what it definitely helped me with, people often think that being a journalist helps because of the writing. Oh, you've made your living out of writing before, it must help you. And to be honest, it doesn't help an enormous amount with the writing, because it's such a different style. Having to write 250 words quickly on a news story is so different to sitting down to write a book of 100,000 words, and everything, the process you go through is entirely different. I think one thing it helps with is you have to write a synopsis basically to get that first book deal. And it's really helped to write a synopsis. Most authors I know, a vast majority of them hate writing a synopsis. But I think, oh, it's great. I can praise everything back down into a few hundred words, which is what I was trying to do. But more than anything, what helped me about it was, I say, just that thing of meeting so many people from different backgrounds. The very nature of the job is that you tend to meet people who unfortunately have either been involved in something very sad, very traumatic, often life-changing, and you have the privilege, and it is a privilege, of talking to them about their experiences. I mean, obviously it's not just that, you know, there are all sorts of people you interview. I remember one day, and I actually interviewed a cabinet minister in the morning and a recovering drug addict in the afternoon. I have to say that he was in the afternoon much more interested in the government minister at the time. But and what that does, it trains you really well to listen. And I think that's a huge part of being a good journalist, but also a good author, is just listening to people's stories, listening to how they tell them. And actually thinking about, you know, how people have coped with these things, because there is a similarity. Because I often say, as a writer, essentially in lots of my books, what I'm doing is I essentially throw a hand grenade into people's lives as an author and say, right, you know, this has happened, how are you all going to cope? And a lot of that goes back to me hearing and learning about how people have coped with really tough things that have happened to them. So I think it's been really helpful in that way.
So have any of your plots or your characters came from the type of things that you were dealing with when you were a journalist?
Yeah, there's one in particular which was my fourth novel, And Then It Happened, and that was really entirely inspired by a case I covered, which was a man who is in a coma, and he was in a persistent vegetative state. He'd had a heart attack. It was during an ambulance strike, years ago now. I'm trying to think when it would have been, but a long time ago. They didn't get him to the hospital in time, and I say he ended up in a coma. And when I met him, I met his wife. And after a year in hospital, she was told that there's nothing more they could do for him. He'll be in this persistent vegetative state for life, and she should put him in a home. And she said, no, he's my husband. I'm going to look after him. And she took him home. And when I met her, she cared for her husband for 10 years in that persistent vegetative state. He was in the living room of her house because she didn't want to put him in a home. And her name was Jean Dennis. I'm still in touch with her. She's the most incredible woman. And very sadly, her husband, John, died, I think, about 5 years after I met her. But that love and care and devotion she showed was, you know, something which stayed with me forever. You know, I could never forget it. And I just came up with this idea of, you know, the impact something like that can have in a family. And again, I changed the story completely. And it happened to a young couple whose husband had an accident at work. So there was children involved, there were family relationships involved. But yeah, that was sort of the one book which was really entirely inspired by a story I'd covered.
Did she ever know that the book was sort of inspired by her? Did you ever
Yes,
tell
no,
her?
she did. It was really nice. And I did an event at a Birmingham Book Festival after it came out, and she came over from Bedford, where she lived, to be there, which was lovely. And I say we've kept in touch and met up since. And no, it's really lovely. And as I said, all I wanted to do was, you know, make people think about really, you know, what some people are dealing with. And it's the old thing, we pass someone in the street or we speak to them on the phone, and we have no idea sometimes what they might be dealing with in their life, and how incredible people are, yeah, and the incredible acts of selfless love and devotion that people can do. And I think that was utterly inspiring.
Oh, definitely. And I just think that's a lovely story.
Yeah.
So in terms of your writing, what's the structure to your normal day?
Yeah, it's been very much, I mean, I got my first book deal when my son was just under a year old, well, it's just over a year old. So The first 4 years were very much a lot of juggling between me and my husband, both self-employed, and whoever was home was looking after my son, and then the other one was working. My husband's a photographer, so he would go out to work, so it was grabbing every time that he comes. So now my son's 2 weeks off leaving school, so all those years of working school hours, and I'm finally seeing the end of that, which is great. So but yeah, it tends to be very much, I treat it as you have to, I think, I treat it like a job, and I sit down and start work at 9 o'clock. I mean, it's not a 9 to 5, because things come up, things that you have to do during that time. Is obviously the benefits of working from home, but equally I will often then do another session in the evening, often quite late into the night. I either tend to get my admin stuff done usually in the afternoon, sort of mid-afternoon, when it feels like I need a break, go for a walk, and then I'll come back at the evening and we'll write again. And I often write, I mean, the others in my house will go to bed, leave me writing, and I often get some of my best work done when the house is quiet, everything's still, and I can just write without any distractions. So I think, it's good that it teaches you to just grab, certainly being a parent has taught me to just grab the time you have, and make the most of it. So, which is useful. Yeah.
I think you're definitely right. And I think in the pandemic as well, when people have been homeschooling, it must have been a nightmare if you were working from home and have younger children as well.
Yes.
Terrible. So in terms of your writing, are you a plotter or do you fly by the seat of your pants?
Yeah, I am a plotter. Yeah, very much in the plotting camp. I've got huge respect for those that do the fly by the seat of your pants thing, but it's not for me. And I think that's all I can say. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's what works for you. So I suppose, I think partly because with my first novel, which was never published, in hindsight, I suppose the thing I'd have done differently is to do more plotting and planning before I'd started, and so there'll be less rewriting at the end. And so that's a lesson I learned the hard way, I suppose, with my first novel, and I've never wanted to repeat that. So I tend to put, it's usually a good 2 months, depending on the amount of research I have to do. It can be longer than that, but at least 2 months, which is just from the initial idea, fleshing it out into a synopsis. Oddly, the first thing I do on any book is, and again, I'm quite weird, I think, doing this, but I write the blurb on the back of the book, because I figure if I can't do that, and again, praising my story and sell it to a reader before I start, then I'm not ready to start. So quite often they get left, and they make it to the back as well. I quite like to be proud that there's a lot of my blurbs are actually out there. Often editors and other people might work on it, but I do like to do that. And then I expand it to a synopsis, and then I expand it to chapter plans, and even as far as scene plans.
Oh, wow.
So I have stacks of notes going through, so that when I start work on it, I essentially sit down, and rather than thinking I'm starting work on a 100,000 word novel, I think, okay, I've got to write scene 1, and in this one I introduce this character, X and Y happen, and that's it. And it just, for me, it frees me up. People say, oh, doesn't that stifle your imagination? And I find it's the other way around, because I have that blueprint, because I don't have to worry about going off on a tangent, because I've set everything out and how to do it. Then I feel complete freedom to write that scene and to do it. And obviously along the way, you will find that there'll be little changes you make, and you think, actually, those 2 chapters could be combined into one, or a minor character you start to really like and think, I'm going to give you a bit of a bigger role than I was planning to do, because I actually really enjoy, I think you're an important character. So there will be changes along the way, but essentially that stays the same, and that really helps me. And then with the characters, again, I do some quite unusual things. One of the things is I really like to have a picture of them in my head, and I've actually got a big folder of pictures cut out of magazines and catalogues, and sometimes printed off the internet, and I go through all these pictures once I have my characters in my head and try to find them.
And I've never heard that.
No, I have never met anyone else who's done it. So and then I put them on my wall. So I think you've got here Nicola, husband James, Ruby, Maisie, Betty, Irene, and John. And they lived on my wall basically while I wrote that book. And it's always actually, it's the first thing I do. So before I start writing anything, the characters are there. And the last thing I do on a book is to take those characters down and then ready to start preparing and finding my next set of, and it feels like you're casting the novel. It's quite funny, you know, it feels like that, but it becomes really important, and it brings them alive to me completely, which I say for whatever reason, it just works for me. And I also, again, maybe this is a journalist thing, but I interview them. I submit them to a questionnaire, like one of those Sunday supplement things on the psychiatrist's couch type thing. So I'll ask questions like, what keeps you awake at night? What's your biggest regret? Who would you like to say sorry to and why? All these sorts of questions. And I don't start until I know the answers to those questions for all the characters in my books, so that when I actually start first scene, chapter 1, I really feel that I know them. I feel I know what journey I'm going to take them on. And that's the point where I start.
You can tell that because your characters are so well developed. I mean, you can't tell you do that whole process, but it does show in your writing. Do you not feel as though you're sort of losing members of your family when you take them down off the wall?
Yeah, it does. It's actually really quite heartbreaking, particularly some of the children, you know, the child characters you get really attached to, and it does sort of feel, and you know, again, the others here laugh at me because they become real. And one year when I was writing, it was the story about the coma actually, and I was writing my Christmas card list, as you do, and I actually put Mel and Adam, who were the characters from it, and I had to cross it off and remind myself that they don't actually exist, only in my head. So but I think that's good. I think, you know, if they're that real to you, that, as you say, will hopefully come over to the reader. And you know, I'd hate to be writing a book where I was sitting down thinking, what was their name again, and what colour's their hair, and you know, what's their backstory. I really want to know them, so that's what I do.
No, there's definitely depth to your characters that does come across in your books, but now I know exactly why. That's fabulous. So you've talked a little bit about your characters. How do you go about researching your books?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and it varies from book to book, obviously, depending on the subject matter. So with the last thing she told me, sometimes you start off and you think, there won't be much research on this, and then you get to a point and you think, hang on a minute. So with that one, there are a series of flashbacks in the book. I'm not going to reveal too much, so I don't want to spoil it for anyone that hasn't read it yet. But the flashbacks are set during the Second World War, and they're set in North Yorkshire. Involving Land Army girls and members of the Royal Canadian Air Force who were stationed there. And that was sort of something which just came together through my research. I was trying to find out about wartime Britain and Yorkshire and where people were stationed, where the land girls were and all of that. And it was just fascinating. And I went to the library essentially and got every book out they had about land girls and wartime Yorkshire. And went through them, and I was just looking for little details. And very often when you're doing that sort of research, if you do it well, very little of it will end up in the book, and you don't want it to, because otherwise it becomes a book about Second World War Land Army girls, and that's not it. But you're just looking for that little detail that will bring it to life, that will hopefully, you know, really make your story fixed in that time or in that place, whatever it is. So sometimes it's research like that. With my latest novel, One Moment, one of the characters has schizophrenia. Now, I'd had experience with a friend and family with schizophrenia, but I still knew I had a lot to learn about it. So I went online. So many websites are great for this. So I went to Mind, and they have lots of videos of mental health service users talking about the conditions and how it impacts on them, and carers and family members. So that sort of stuff is invaluable. And it does take a lot of time. And, you know, sometimes there are medical conditions, other things that I'll be looking at, all sorts of things. The book I'm currently writing involves a family who are basically trying to apply for British citizenship. They're originally French and French Moroccan. So I've looked at the whole sort of Brexit process of, you know, what they went through about trying to apply for settled status and all of that. So there's often some really complex things to look at. But again, it has to be done. And I probably helped by the fact that I'm a journalist. I'm used to doing research, so I know where to go and how to do it. And probably because of that as well, you know, I'm really passionate about making sure that everything is realistic and everything is correct. You know, I know it's a work of fiction, but I still want within it the things that happen to be you know, accurate. So that's the work that I'll put in.
It's heartwarming that you said you went to your library and got the books out.
I know, that's what you're
I
there
keep
for.
saying this to people I'm interviewing, but we love people that love libraries. From all of your books, what's been your hardest scene to write?
Yes, I tend to pick some, my books tend to be quite gritty and have a lot of emotion in them. So there have been a lot of scenes that have been difficult. The one that I would pick out is remembering my fifth novel, The Mummifesto, which tells the story of three women who basically were so fed up with mainstream politics, they decided to set up their own mums party and stand in the general election. So they're a bit ahead of their time, I like to think, that they may yet do it. But and anyway, one of them has a son with a life-limiting illness with spinal muscular atrophy. And again, that was something which involved a lot of research. But there came a scene in that which we knew was coming when he would get admitted to a hospice. And kind of everyone knew it was going to come, but it was when it did come. And I found that incredibly hard to write. My own son was only a few years older at the time, and it just really, really pulled at my heartstrings to do it. And I had tears streaming down my face while I was writing it. He was begging me not to do it because he wanted him to. So, you know, anything like that is a really tough scene. And again, I relied on my research. You know, I'd visited hospices, I'd done a lot of research and online and talked to people. And I wanted to do it justice. You know, I wanted to tell the story and do it justice. But I think on a scene like that, you're very aware that it's really important that you do it sensitively and in a way that's going to move readers, but also accurately as well. So, yeah, I think that was probably the toughest one I've had.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like it.
Yeah.
So how have you evolved as a writer from your first book to your 10th book?
Yeah, I like to think that I've got better at my craft as I've gone along. I think you'd be worried if you hadn't, wouldn't you? You know, so, you know, I have learned with every book, and I will carry on learning with every book. You know, I have no doubt about it. And I'd probably say, yes, it does get a bit easier in the sense that you know what to expect, you know how it tends to work, you know what the pitfalls are. So I would say probably my procedure is a lot slicker than it was at the beginning, because I'm clear what I need to do and following all that plotting and planning, and I know that works for me. I know it's important to do it. So I think, you know, it's I feel more confident that I know what I'm doing, but that doesn't mean to say that it's got any easier in terms of actually still trying to produce, hopefully, a really good story and really powerful characters. And you learn things like, you know, that there's generally a point in every book where you start questioning it and you start thinking, is this really working? Are people going to like this? And you have to keep going through that. You know, every writer has those doubts. You know, the biggest best-selling novelists have those doubts. And actually, I'd be more worried if I didn't have those doubts, I think, because it means hopefully that you are all the time thinking about how you can improve things, how you can make them stronger. But yeah, so I think you know, the process seems almost like second nature to me now. It's a new book, okay, I do this, I do this, I do that. But each time you're taken on a completely different journey with a completely different bunch of characters. And yeah, and I still love it, which is a really important thing. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. From your experience, what advice would you give to anybody just starting to get
Hmm.
published?
I think I would say, and it's a hard one because I know, and it's a mistake I made, because when you start, you're desperate to get this first book written and maybe sent off to an agent, or hopefully then submitted. And I think I would just say, take that time at the beginning to learn your craft. There are some fantastic books out there on creative writing. There are online courses. One of the things that the pandemic has done has got a lot of us online and brought things online which weren't online before. So there's an organisation called ARVON, ARVON, that do some great creative writing courses. There's one near me in Lumbank in West Yorkshire. But they do online courses now, so you can do that. There are all sorts of things available, and I would definitely say it's worth doing that first. You're learning the craft of how to do it, what might work for you, and then if you manage to actually get a first draft written, which is a huge achievement, and loads of people have got half-written novels squirreled away all over the place, but the thing to do then, I would say, is not to send it straight off to an agent. Try and get a critique from a professional editorial service. There's lots of them advertised on the Writers and Artists Yearbook, places you can find out. There's one called the Literary Consultancy I use, TLC, who are really good. And even if you can only afford to get, these are different packages, so even if you can only afford those first 3 chapters and the synopsis to be looked at, do that, because they might save you an enormous amount of rejections by being able to say, oh, this needs looking at, this isn't working. So it's just to really hold back, take your time, listen to people and listen to advice.
I think you're right. And I think there's lots of organisations even in the Northeast. I mean, obviously we've got New Writing North,
Yes.
that does an awful lot. And we do a lot here at the Word as well. So there's plenty of places to go and get help. And it's not being scared to ask for it as well, isn't it? I think some people feel writing's a totally personal thing, but you've got to sort of give it out there to let other people give their critique on it.
If you can find a good writing group, like at your local library or various places, that you need constructive criticism. So obviously you don't want people to just be rude and horrible about it. You want them to offer something constructive, but equally it's no help at all if you just show it to your auntie and she says, oh, it's lovely. That's not going to help you either. So you need people who will actually give you some good feedback.
Definitely. Now we've talked a little bit about your characters and where they came from. So who has been your favorite character to write?
Yes, I'm going to have to say on this one, it's Finn, who was the 10-year-old boy in my 10th novel, One Moment. And I'd always wanted to write a novel from the point of view of a child. Some of my favourite novels are written from the point of view of a child. And it's one of those things that was on my list. I need to do this. And sometimes you get characters in your head, and I've all sorts of little bits of ideas and characters in my head that I'll use at some point in the future. And I had Finn in my head, and the idea with Finn is that he's getting bullied really badly at school. He's different. He's a lad that's different. His passion is gardening. His hero is Alan Titchmarsh. You can imagine that it makes him totally uncool at school. He has no interest in football whatsoever. And a lot of that was actually inspired by my son. He had a really tough time at primary school. He's into performing arts. So he loves acting and singing and dancing and musical theatre is his big love. And again, when you're a 10-year-old boy at school, that's not good. And he got really horribly bullied, and it was incredibly stressful for him most of all, but also for us as parents and for everyone, because there's nothing worse than when your child isn't happy at school. And despite me writing and emailing and going down and phoning them, and it went on for a long time. And I've also I've got huge respect for my son, because he stuck to he wanted to be himself, and he didn't change. It'd been the easiest thing in the world to think, you know what, I'm going to forget all of that, I'm just going to fit in like the rest of them to get through it. And I hugely admire the fact that he said, well, this is who I am, and if they don't like, we haven't got the same interests, that's fine. So when I got to write Finn, there was a lot of my emotion as a parent in there from that, which I think is there. But it was obviously really important to me that Finn wasn't my son. So which is why I gave him completely different passion of gardening. I thought, what might, you know, might he do? And he's just a quirky child who is wonderful and lovely and full of heart. He struggles to make friends at school. He's got one friend called Lottie, who is brilliant, and sticks up for him against all the boys and whatever. And I just loved writing him to bits. And I still, as you know, when we're talking about characters before who are real, and to me, Finn's still out there. And the lovely thing was that, you know, since it was published, I've had so many messages from readers saying, oh, you know, I've got a Finn, or I had one, and my son's now at university doing, I think one of them was theoretical physics, because that was
wow.
he was the geek at school, and he got picked on, and he's followed his passion. And all these wonderful stories of, you know, unusual and individual children who had, you know, gone on and had a tough time and gone on to do their thing. So it felt like something a lot of people could relate to. But yeah, that little boy is just really special to me. And yeah, he's still out there in my head.
Oh, he's a lovely character. Is there a character somebody else has written that you wish you'd written, and why?
Yes. Do you know what? When I think of when I started thinking, I was thinking, you know what? I immediately go to children's literature, because there's something about that, you know, in terms of the characters that have, particularly ones that have lived on for generations. And the character I'm going to pick out is Eeyore, because Eeyore is, as a creation, just the best character. You know what you're going to get with Eeyore. He is what he is. And yes, he's always moaning about the rain, and, you know, always looking on the downside, but he's totally accepted by his friends for being how he is. And I mean, I think Amy was a start. I think the whole group of characters are wonderful. But I think, you know, Eeyore stands out. If I was picking one from adult fiction, I think the one I come up with was Miss Havisham, because I think Dickens is absolutely the master of characters. And if you start thinking of some of the best ever characters in literature, I immediately came up with 3 Dickens characters, you know. So I think Miss Havisham, you know, sitting there in a wedding dress and being utterly, you know, unhinged, is one that stays with you. Yes.
Oh, good choices, Linda. Especially Eeyore. I've got to say, I'm with you on Eeyore. Cracking character. So, with your novels, is it your plot or your location that comes first?
It tends to be probably more the plot. Yeah. All bar my first novel was set in Birmingham, because I was living there, or the most recent place I'd been living when I started writing it. But since then, they've all been set in and around, well, mainly West Yorkshire. I've had one that's Greater Manchester, and one had a bit in North Yorkshire. But I think I love writing about the north of England. You know, I love having my stories set here. I'm passionate about so many wonderful authors we've got that are based here, and stories we've got that are, you know, set in the north of England. So I may well at some point in my career come up with a story that for whatever reason can't be set in the north of England, but for now I'm sticking with it. So that kind of feels like a given. It's just whereabouts, and you know, I really vary between villages, towns, cities. The one I'm writing at the moment is mainly set in Leeds and in and around Leeds. So there's all sorts of things, but it tends to be the plot, the seed of an idea, the what if that you come up with first. Sometimes it's actually comes from the character, and sometimes it's the character that I've thought about first. And I suppose that with Finn, I knew I wanted to write, you know, about a child being bullied. So I wanted to do that issue, and I came up with Finn. And at the same time, I'd had an idea for another character. We were hearing so many cases, we still are, unfortunately, about people who have really struggled when benefit payments have been cut or stopped, and really struggling to survive. And also particularly for those with mental health conditions that are really struggling. So I came up with the idea with the older woman, Kaz, who's nearly 60, and she cares for a younger brother who's got schizophrenia. And they both end up, through circumstances, having benefits cut or stopped or delayed, and having to struggle and deal with that. And for me, that book, it was kind of a light bulb moment at one point where I had the idea of Finn and Kaz meeting by chance, and then what might happen from there. And that's really how I came up with One Moment, because the book starts at the point where they're just about to meet in the first time at a cafe where Kaz works. And what they don't know is that the second time they meet, something happens to them which changes both of their lives forever and throws them together. And so it was just really those two characters and the issues I wanted to write about coming together. So it tends to be a bit like that, and sometimes a bit like a jigsaw, and you're just looking for pieces to slot together and for that to work.
Do you ever take liberties put my teeth back in? Do you ever take liberties as an author and change maybe a geographical feature or a timeline or something to suit the plot?
Certainly with my settings, although I've the vast majority of my settings in my book are real. So a lot of the books at the beginning were set in and around Hebden Bridge, where I was living in Calderdale for the whatever it was, 14 years when I moved to West Yorkshire. But occasionally I will change something. Either, obviously, sometimes there are sensitivities in terms of if it would identify someone. If you say, oh, you know, the character runs the greengrocer in a village, then perhaps a real person that runs a greengrocer in a village won't take kindly. So you have to think about things like that. And sometimes I've changed things in terms of them, perhaps like the distance between places. And I know, I mean, if any of your any visitors know, watch Happy Valley, which was set very near where I lived in Calder Valley. It's set ideally in Hebden Bridge, but those who live there know that actually some of it was filmed in Stawberry Bridge and some of it was filmed in Tomberden, and they all just sort of stuck it together because it worked and to find the right location. So I do a bit of that sometimes. You know, it won't necessarily take half an hour to go between the two places. But I think it's also really important with a plot. I'm always really keen as an author that my plot is led by my characters, and that if you've done the process well and you've thought about your plot and your characters at the beginning as you've devised it, you should always be able to explain and justify why your characters behave in a certain way at each point and why they do things. And if you get yourself in a plot hole, the last thing I want to do is have one of my characters doing something which I don't believe they would say or do. So I think for me, so the work needs to go in at the beginning to make sure that doesn't happen.
Have any of your readers ever corrected you if you have taken a slight liberty in terms of distance or location or anything like that?
Yes, you do. You do tend to get, I mean, I love the fact that readers can get in touch with you about everything, and mostly it's fantastic, but I've had one or two that would say, I think it's really hard, isn't it? But yeah, that have said, oh, well, I used to live there and that building wasn't there at that time, or something like that. So I think you've just got to say to people, look, you know, sometimes you use a little bit of artistic license, but hopefully it's generally, true to how things are.
Definitely. I'm sure some readers go through everything with a fine-tooth comb and they're marking it off and writing it down. It just make me chuckle a little bit at times, I have to say. So don't forget, everyone in the audience, if you have any questions for Linda, do type them in the chat.
Yes,
blub, 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 and then I can ask Linda those. Now we're going to talk a little bit about your books. So we normally just talk about your latest book, but I think we need to go back to the last thing she told me, because that was the one that was picked up for the Reed Regional campaign.
Absolutely, yeah.
And for those of you out there that don't know about the Reed Regional campaign, New Writing North run a campaign every year, and it's bringing and connecting the best Northeast writers with Northeast audiences. And it's really fabulous. We've had some wonderful authors, including Linda, through the years. And how did it feel like to be chosen as a Reed Regional author?
It's lovely, and one of the things that's particularly lovely about it is that librarians are involved in choosing the books. Yay, another shout out for librarians. But that really means the world, because when things are chosen by people whose whose whole lives revolve around books and reading, and that story has actually really resonated with them, it's lovely. So no, I felt really honoured when I heard that it had been picked out and selected. And we had a lovely day in Newcastle where we got to meet all the other writers involved. And it's as you say, it's a fantastic range of writers. So we had poets and, all sorts of different writers, different genres, crime and romance and everything in there. So it was just say lovely to be involved, and I managed to get 2 visits done to libraries before we all were locked down last year, so the rest of them were doing like this virtually. But no, it was really special.
So can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, so basically the last thing she told me deals with family secrets and 4 generations of females in the family, and how their lives have been impacted by the secrets that have been kept along the way. And this is another book where actually the inspiration for the idea came partly from real life and partly from things that were going on in the news at the time. So the real life aspect was sadly my grandmother died. She was 92, so she'd had an amazing life. But she was went into a home for the last few months of her life, and was about to, when we knew she only had a very short time left. She lived down in North London where I was born, so I wasn't there, but my parents and my sister were. And just before she died, she'd taken her teeth out, which so it wasn't quite easy to hear her, but the last thing she said basically was to tell them where to go and look after she died to find something that belonged to her. It was something to look for. And they obviously didn't really understand what she was saying or why. And obviously the first question was to say, well, what is it? They were thinking, is she losing, her clarity a bit? She'd had her marbles right up to the end, so maybe she was getting confused. But I say, unfortunately, she passed away. That was the very last thing that she said. And it was several weeks really after the funeral before they finally got round to looking. It was to find something in the shed, of all places, that she'd said was there. And she was a hoarder, my nan. So she was one of these people that had your house full of everything for life. She'd lived in that house for 70 years since she'd been married, so it was all sorts in there. And so it was like going through levels of sedimentary rock to get to obviously at the beginning. And they found what obviously she'd been referring to, which looked like some kind of a memorial to a loss. But nothing with it, no words, no writing, no photos, nothing, just this, a small handmade thing. And we'll never know. There was nobody left to ask. She'd never spoken to her children about it or anyone in the family. And it just got me thinking about the sort of secrets, particularly women of her generation had to keep, for so many, or felt they had to keep, because very often about the shame that was put on women at the time. So, we don't know. She only moved to that house after she was married. We don't know what the real story is. I suspect maybe she had a miscarriage or a loss of some kind, but it could have been something completely different. We just don't know. But she wanted to mark, her loss in some way. And it just got me thinking about that generation. And also at that time, we were hearing about cases, if you've watched the film Philomena, and the cases of the Magdalene Laundry girls in Ireland, who are made to give up their babies, for the sin of having them out of wedlock, and years of being, parted from their children. And I just thought, there's so much here that we need to explore and to think about what these women have suffered over the years. And then it made me start thinking about having this generations, because although, thank goodness that having a baby out of wedlock is no longer considered something that's socially unacceptable, there are still things today which women get shamed for. The Me Too movement was just sort of starting up when I was writing it. And it made me think about the secrets that all sorts of women have kept and not felt able to tell the truth for all sorts of reasons. So I sort of came up and I wrote a family tree of Betty, who was the great grandmother's family. And I started thinking about in different generations and when they were young, what would have been going on and what secrets they might have kept. So that's really the background to it. And that's what I wanted to explore.
It is a fabulous book. I know we were chatting just before we came on air, and we've just done it with our Zoom reading group, and everybody, they just loved it.
Oh, it's lovely to hear that.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
got some little twists, and really good, and love the characters as well. So how did it feel when it was picked as a Richard and Judy book?
No, that was really special because essentially what happens is that each cycle, there's, I think it's somewhere between 4 and 6 different sets of Richard and Judy book a year now. And each cycle, when it comes up, publishers are asked to just submit one, I think there's maybe a maximum of 1 or 2 books to go forward to be looked at by the production team. And I knew it had been put forward, but so had lots of other books. So, you just don't know. So to actually get an email from the editor and be told they've picked it was amazing, because I talked a little bit at the beginning about those 7 years of rejections and not knowing. And there was one particular incident that I got to meet Richard and Judy. We did a podcast with them as part of the promotion, and I told them this story at the time that somewhere about 5 years into that 7 years of rejection, I remember going into WH Smith's and there was a display of books by the author Jane Green, and I'd had a rejection that morning. And it just broke me, and I just started crying in the middle of WH.
Oh, bless!
I was with my husband, and he had to take me out of the shop because I was saying, it's never going to be my book, I'm never going to see it there. So to actually be a Richard and Judy book and to go into the Smiths and see your book on that stand when you'd had, all those years of thinking it's never going to happen, it meant a huge amount. It really did. And the lovely thing is it brings your books to a wider audience, because it's nice to think there are readers that follow you through, but it brought my books to readers that had never read a Linda Green book before, and then they'll go on to read other my previous books, and hopefully future ones. So no, it was great.
And One Moment's been picked as a Radio 2 book club book as well. How did that happen?
I know, that's a sort of a similar sort of thing, really, in that publishers are asked to just submit one book to send to Radio 2 again for each cycle. And I got to meet Jo Wiley, which was lovely, and be on the show and talk about the book. But again, it's just a real honour, and she was fantastic and really interested in the subject matter. So it was great. And again, it's just bringing your books to new audiences. And I got a lovely email sometime after I was on from a chap who said he'd been ploughing his field in his tractor, listening to me on Jo Wiley talk about the book, and he thought, that sounds good, and had gone out and got it. And then when he finished, he wrote me a little email saying how much he'd enjoyed it. And I thought, that was really good, because you didn't realise when you're sitting there talking to Jo Wiley that, there's going to be some chap in a tractor ploughing his field that's going to think, I'll buy that tomorrow, and really enjoyed it. So lovely.
I think you're right. It's that promotion and everything that goes along with it that does sort of expose your books to a much wider audience. And as an author, that's just got to be fabulous.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're sort of running out of time, but we do have some audience questions. So I'll read through those for you. From Laura, how long does each novel take you to write, and do you set yourself a deadline? And she said you're very interesting, and she also wants to know, do you type or handwrite?
Oh, yes. Okay, so first one, I type. One of the very good things about being a journalist is that you learn to touch type, which is really handy. So yes, I always type them, and I was used to, as a journalist, typing my stories straight up. The whole process tends to take just over a year. So there's usually a couple of months of that planning, preparation, research, maybe 6 or 7 months of actually writing a first draft, followed by a couple of months usually of revisions and rewriting and polishing and getting it right. And then finally the last steps of the proof pages, and then sorting out the promotion. So it's about a year if it works well, sometimes a little bit longer. Yeah, with that process.
Question from Michelle. Your books are quite emotional and heartbreaking to read. How does it affect you when you're writing them?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. No, it does. As I said, it really affects me. I get hugely involved with the characters. I don't think I've written a book yet where I haven't at some point during the writing of that book shed a tear as I'm writing it. And I hope that continues, because if I'm writing books which are supposed to be emotional and provoke that sort of response in readers, then I want to feel it too. And if I'm not feeling it, what chances, a reader got? So that they are tough to do that, and I do get really involved with the characters, and the closer I get to the end of the book, the more intense the writing process tends to get. So my family have learned that for the last sort of 2 or 3 weeks, best left alone, really. And if I'm lucky, I'll get food and snacks brought to me. I just carry on, and I'm totally in those characters worlds with that. I know you mentioned about a deadline. Your publisher gives you a deadline once you've written the first one, so which is good because it keeps you on your toes. Although obviously sometimes there are circumstances. I had to have an eye op last year. I've got a macular pucker in my eye, which really slowed things down. Still not right now, but obviously that put a spanner in the works of my deadline, and it's why now the next book won't be out until the next year. So things happen, but it's just to have the discipline to carry on working to a deadline, really.
And we've got 2 questions from Anne. The first one's really difficult because it's like asking you to choose your favourite child. Which of your own books is your favourite, and a favourite book by another author?
Okay, so it doesn't always work that the last one you wrote is your favourite, but I have to say it's One Moment. I think probably for the reasons that I said, the fact that it's partly narrated by 10-year-old Finn, and it's just a book that I feel really close to, I think because of that situation with my son. So that has to be my favourite. In terms of my favourite novels, it's going to have to be To Kill a Mockingbird, because it was, like many people, I suppose, I read it as a teenager. It's one of those books you read and stays with you. And I read it to my son, a few years ago. And it's a book that, one of the few books that I'll go back and reread, because it is so special. And the characters, I think Atticus Finch is just, quite the character, as is Scout. And so that would be my favourite book.
Excellent. And we'll just do one last question from me. Just a bit of fun, this one. You're stranded on a desert island. Which 3 books, you can't have To Kill a Mockingbird, would you take with you, and which author would you also take with you?
This is a top question. Right, so I am going to take The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. I don't know if anyone's read that one. Hugely recommended. It's a big book for a start, which is always good on a desert island, and it follows the life of Cyril Avery, character in Ireland, over his entire life. Basically, it starts as a child and goes right on. And it's funny, it's sad, it's thought-provoking. The characters will stay with you forever. So that ticks off my box of being like laughing, crying, which is always a good thing with that. I would take The Life of Pi by Jan Martel, because that's another of my favourite books. And I think that would give me hope that, anything can happen, and a belief that, yes, you might be stranded on a desert island, but do you know what, if he survived being stranded on a boat with a tiger and a collection of animals, then I think I could survive the desert island experience with it. And probably my third one, I was gonna have to be, I'm trying to think, I would probably go for The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger, because I think that's for me, it was the ultimate love story. And I love the fact that you had to totally suspend disbelief and just go with it. And yet she created the characters and the story so well and so movingly that I went there and I thought it was wonderful. So they would be my books. I would take Margaret Atwood with me as an author, because she's my favourite author. So whatever, but also I know I've read those essays she wrote as a wilderness tip. So she's brilliant at surviving on her own out in the wilderness. So I think she'd be really good at campfires and, you know, all the practical things. You could have some amazing discussions with her about her writing and everything. So I want to go there now. Yeah.
Good choices. Apart from, I've got to differ on The Time Traveler's Wife, because of all the books I've read, it infuriated me on so many levels.
Don't worry, I get that. I didn't like the film. I should say that. I really, really didn't like the film. But and I think sometimes as a writer, you write those books and you know that some people, they're Marmite books, really, aren't they?
Yeah,
and you know that some people will love it and some people will hate it. So I was in the right camp, but I totally get that you're not. Yes.
I think you're right. It's one that just divided people right down the middle.
Yeah.
But Linda, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this evening.
Thank you.
Hopefully when your new book's out, you'll come and actually visit us at
I would love to come in,
because I've got pages of questions still left to ask you. So we'll have to come and pay a visit, definitely.
I would love to do that. And thank you to everybody who's joined us tonight. It's a shame I can't be there in person, but as I said, I hope that I will get back. And please do feel free to send me any more questions you have that we haven't got to. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, so have a find and send me a message, do.
Definitely. And thank you to our lovely audience. We've got a couple of more Zoom events coming up. Those are on the Words website. And I'm also in the process of programming our Write Festival for September, hopefully with people coming into buildings, and there is lots and lots of interesting stuff going on then, so do watch out, and all of those will be appearing on the Words website. So once again, thank you so much, Linda, thank you everybody from coming. Oh, and thank you to Tom, who's our tech support tonight.
Yes, thank you, Tom.
I didn't mention that at the start, but Tom's been sitting here patiently all night being our tech support as well. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Bye.